There is a certain kind of man who moves through the first half of life feeling as though he is carrying something he cannot name. Not a gift, not a curse, just a sealed container he never received instructions for. He grows up watching others move quickly, decide quickly, belong quickly. Meanwhile, he senses layers inside himself that don't have a place in the world yet. And when he tries to explain this difference, this slowness, this saturation, people often mistake it for hesitation or fragility. Eventually, he begins to mistake it too. Here is the first misunderstanding I want to name clearly, because it hides in the minds of so many men watching this. You think something is wrong with you because your depth didn't translate into competence early. But depth isn't designed to perform on command. Depth ferments. Depth takes time. Imagine a bottle stored in an old wine cellar, sealed and untouched for decades. From the outside, it looks like neglect, dust, darkness, stillness. But anyone who understands aging knows the truth. The bottle is not failing to be opened. It is becoming what it could never be if opened too soon. Many men over 50 discover, often reluctantly, that this was their inner life all along, an archive maturing quietly behind their ribs while the world kept asking for quick answers. Cultures throughout history have understood this archetype. The monk who was dismissed in youth but becomes an oracle in age. The desert hermit whose silence was mocked until kings sought him out. The craftsman whose early work was ordinary, but whose later years produced pieces with a depth no one saw coming. These figures weren't late bloomers. They were long fermenters. For the modern man, though, this slow maturation can feel like a private tension he never learned to articulate. For half his life, he may carry the sense of being out of rhythm with the world, too solitary in a culture of noise, too idealistic in a culture of shortcuts, too observant in a culture that prizes speed over depth. And he may not realize these qualities were never deficiencies. They were developmental timelines the world never taught him to trust. But there is a cost to misunderstanding one's own architecture. Many men reach midlife with the painful suspicion that they spent decades performing versions of themselves that were never quite true, choosing roles, partners, careers, even friendships that didn't match the shape of their inner life. They sense years lived under the wrong expectations, as if they rehearsed a script written for someone else. If any part of that feels familiar, there's no blame here. Neuroscience adds a quiet but grounding piece of context. The systems involved in metacognition, seeing your own patterns, and high-level pattern integration often don't reach their mature form until the late 40s or even the 50s. In other words, you were not defective. You were not late. Your nervous system was still assembling the depth you were meant to live from. So the real question emerging in this stage of life is not, why did I struggle so much? But something more intimate, more unsettling, and more liberating. If your rare traits were dormant, what else in your life have you misinterpreted as failure when it was actually latency? Your relationships, your career choices, your self-worth. How much of it was judged before the full architecture of your mind was ready to reveal itself? If you want to stay with this exploration, we'll go slowly, layer by layer. At the midpoint of this video, we'll name one shadow pattern that men over 50 often mistake for wisdom, a pattern that quietly blocks individuation. For now, simply notice the soft possibility rising beneath the surface. Maybe you weren't behind. Maybe you were simply becoming. There is a particular wound that forms early in the lives of men with deep, introspective personalities, and it rarely comes from aggression or cruelty. More often, it comes from misinterpretation. A boy who notices subtle shifts in the room, who feels undercurrents others ignore, who processes slowly because he is processing thoroughly, is often told he is too much or not enough at the same time. Too sensitive, too quiet, too observant, too inward. These messages do not attack his character, they attack his tempo. And when a boy's natural pace is treated as a problem, he eventually believes the problem is him. One of the quiet realities many men discover after 50 is that what they called insecurity was often something far simpler. They grew up in environments that could not read them. A man cannot develop confidence in traits no one was able to mirror. Depth becomes self-doubt. Precision becomes perfectionism. Sensitivity becomes shame. Many men leave childhood believing they are difficult, when in truth, they were merely different. Here is a reframing that may shift something inside you. What you internalized as weakness was often just complexity growing faster than your context could understand. This is not an excuse. It is a map. And maps allow us to reinterpret the past without drowning in it. In Jungian language, men with strong introverted intuition or introverted feeling often carry an inner architecture that matures slowly. These functions move inward before they move outward. They gather impressions, symbols, emotional data, subtle meaning. They compare the present moment with deeper patterns most people never notice. But when the outer world rewards speed, simplicity, and visible results, this form of intelligence is misread as hesitation. The man learns to apologize for his depth before he understands it. Something subtle happens then. The boy who needs time becomes the man who feels defective for needing time. He pushes himself into faster decisions, faster careers, faster identities, trying to outrun the pace that actually protects him. He hides his contemplative nature behind humor or competence. He engages in relationships that demand immediacy instead of resonance, and eventually he begins to fear his own slowness, mistaking incubation for stagnation. But depth never disappears. It waits. At this point in life, many men describe a quiet, lifelong tension, being internally repelled by superficial goals while lacking the language to explain why. They might look lazy or indecisive from the outside, but internally, they are navigating something more complex. They cannot force themselves toward paths that have no symbolic weight. Their nervous systems simply do not fire for hollow incentives. And because they cannot articulate this, they blame themselves for not wanting what everyone else seems to want. Here is the slightly confronting line that tends to make men pause. You didn't fail to chase superficial goals. You were never built for them in the first place. That is why your energy collapsed every time you attempted to pretend otherwise. From a neurobiological perspective, some people experience slower dopamine reward cycles. They do not get strong satisfaction from short-term achievements or social validation. Their system is oriented toward long-range meaning. In a culture of quick wins, this can look like inadequacy. But in the long arc of a life, especially after 50, it becomes a form of endurance, clarity, and inner coherence. When we look at this through a compassionate yet honest lens, a pattern reveals itself. Your so-called failures were often refusals, not conscious refusals, but instinctive ones. A deeper part of your psyche refusing premature closure, refusing to collapse your life into shapes that could not hold your truth. And perhaps the most important recognition for this stage is this: you were never slow, you were incubating. Every deep-rooted personality begins this way. The early misdiagnosis of depth as defect is not the end of the story, it is the threshold. Because once a man begins to recognize the truth of his own tempo, the next chapter emerges. The moment when the persona he carried for decades can no longer hold its shape. Whenever you're ready, we'll step into that moment, the collision between the dutiful outer self and the shadow that has been waiting to speak. By the time a man reaches midlife, he has usually built something that looks stable from the outside. A career that pays the bills, a reputation for being dependable, a set of roles that he performs well enough for others to assume he is anchored. Yet internally, something far quieter has been happening for years, a slow tension accumulating behind the mask he learned to wear in order to survive his earlier misinterpretations. This mask, what Jung would call the persona, often forms around duty, not love, not desire, not calling, but duty. Many men can trace the outlines of this persona back to a childhood shaped by hyper-responsibility. The belief that other people's emotional stability depends on him. He becomes the peacekeeper, the reliable one, the one who swallows disappointment so the room stays calm. It is a noble role, but it extracts a private cost. Over decades, the persona stretches thinner and thinner, not because the man is failing, but because the mask no longer fits the size of the life growing beneath it. Here is a reframing that often unsettles men just enough to invite honesty. Exhaustion is rarely about effort alone. It is often the body's protest against living a life that does not match its inner truth. The man who has carried too many expectations for too long eventually begins to feel a strange kind of numbness. Not depression in the clinical sense, though the lines can blur, but a flattening. Victories that feel hollow, successes that taste metallic, milestones that land with no emotional weight. He finds himself achieving what he once chased, only to discover there is no pulse inside the accomplishment. Kahneman's work on cognitive load helps illuminate this moment. Sustaining an identity that contradicts one's inner architecture drains psychological resources at a rate the system cannot maintain indefinitely. The appearance of stability requires constant self-regulation. The inner world, however, knows the truth, and at some point the cost becomes unsustainable. This is where the collision forms. The persona, built to secure belonging and minimize disruption, begins to fracture under its own accumulated weight. Many men fear they are falling apart when this happens, but something more precise is taking place. The psyche is withdrawing energy from a role it can no longer authentically inhabit. What looks like collapse is often the beginning of coherence. There is a line here that tends to land heavily because it turns the narrative upside down. You are not losing interest in your old life because you have failed. You are losing interest because that life was never yours to begin with. It is not a failure of capacity. It is a failure of alignment. And alignment, unlike effort, cannot be forced. One of the most subtle yet consistent signals in this stage is the loss of joy in the pursuits that once motivated him. The promotion he wanted no longer moves him. The validation he sought feels strangely distant. The achievements he used to chase now feel like evidence of a contract he never consciously signed. His dopamine curve flattens not because he is broken, but because the rewards he is receiving do not correspond to the life his deeper self is trying to grow into. This is often the moment when a man begins to sense that his life has been structured around compliance rather than calling. He may not yet know what his calling is. Most men don't at this point. But he can feel the internal recoil whenever he forces himself back into the old pattern. The psyche, which tolerated the costume for years, now refuses to counterfeit itself even one day longer. There is a quiet mercy in this. The collapse is not sabotage, it is an interruption, a boundary drawn by the deeper self. The man who reaches this threshold often stands at a crossroads he did not ask for. The mask is slipping, the old motivations no longer activate, and the body, tired of carrying borrowed expectations, begins to tell the truth before the mind is ready to hear it. But every collapse reveals something that was hidden before. An old wound, long ignored, now rising to the surface. The next chapter turns toward that wound, because it carries the key to unlocking the strength that has been waiting beneath the persona for decades. Whenever you choose to move forward, we will enter the terrain where the ancestral father shadow begins to speak. As the persona weakens, and the deeper self begins to push forward, another layer rises from beneath the surface, the father shadow. Not the literal father alone, but the image of him that lives inside the psyche. Every man carries this internal figure, whether he speaks of his father fondly, bitterly, or hardly at all. And for many men who bloom late, this internal father has been quietly shaping their sense of permission, ambition, and self-worth long before they ever noticed its presence. For some, the father was distant, physically present, emotionally absent. For others, he was critical, unpredictable, or stoic to the point of invisibility. Some fathers offered praise only for performance, not for presence. Others punished vulnerability without meaning to. Most did not intend harm. They were simply repeating patterns inherited from men who came before them. But the boy internalizes the wound differently than the man understands it later. To a child, the father is not just a person. He is the first architecture of authority. Here is a reframing that often unsettles something deep inside. What you call self-sufficiency may be the shape your loneliness took when you realized no one was coming to meet you emotionally. Many men who appear strong, independent, or unbothered are carrying this adaptation. Their competence hides a wound. Their silence protects a tenderness that once went unanswered. And somewhere inside, the boy who could not afford to need anyone grows into a man who mistakes distance for dignity. This is where Jung's idea of the father archetype becomes practical. The inner father is the voice that tells a man whether he has the right to exist as himself. It is the tone of permission inside his mind. If his father diminished him, the inner father becomes a critic. If his father ignored him, the inner father becomes silent. If his father competed with him, the inner father becomes a judge who limits his own expansion. And as long as that inner voice goes unexamined, a man may unconsciously restrict his life to avoid confronting that inherited authority. The confronting line in this chapter is simple, and many men pause when they hear it. You were not afraid of failure. You were afraid of your own magnitude. Failure is familiar. Failure keeps the peace. Failure does not threaten anyone. But stepping into the fullness of one's personality, into creativity, leadership, desire, clarity, can feel like betraying some old, unspoken agreement with the father shadow. Do not outshine. Do not disrupt. Do not want too much. This is why many men do not blossom until later life. The psyche, in its own strange wisdom, withholds full self-actualization until there is enough emotional autonomy to withstand the internal judgment. The delay is not sabotage, it is protection. The self waits until the man is strong enough to face the one authority he has carried inside for decades. There is a gentle yet revealing way to sense where the father shadow still holds influence. It is not a directive, but an invitation to notice. When imagining a choice that feels both right and risky, creative work, a new boundary, a change in direction, ask quietly, if no internal authority were evaluating this, what would feel possible? Not what is impressive, not what is safe, not what is expected, simply what feels true in the absence of inherited judgment. Sometimes the reaction is subtle, a tightening in the chest, a pull of guilt, a faint sense of disloyalty to someone who hasn't spoken in years. That tension is not a flaw, it is the map. It reveals exactly where the father shadow has been shaping the edges of one's life without consent. When this pattern becomes visible, something important loosens. The man begins to sense a new kind of sovereignty. Not rebellion, not defiance, but authorship. He starts to differentiate between the voice he inherited and the voice that is truly his. And as this separation unfolds, the landscape of his relationships shifts as well, sometimes in ways he did not anticipate. Because once the father shadow is named, the heart becomes more discerning. The relational patterns that once felt like fate begin to feel like choices. And this shift prepares the ground for the next transformation, the reorientation of love, desire, and connection after 50. Whenever you decide to continue, we will step into the chapter where relationships stop revolving around old wounds and begin to reflect regulation, clarity, and self-respect. When a man begins to reclaim his inner authority, something else in his life quietly changes, often before he has language for it. His patterns of attraction, his tolerance for emotional volatility, his instinctive pull toward intensity. These shifts are rarely dramatic. They unfold in the body before they appear in thought. And for many men with deep, introspective personalities, this transition marks one of the clearest signs that the old self is dissolving. Throughout earlier decades, relationships often carried a familiar tone, unpredictable partners, emotional highs followed by disorienting lows, a sense of trying to earn closeness that never quite settled. Many men later realize that what they once mistook for passion was a reenactment of the nervous system's earliest lessons about love. Chaos feels alive when stability feels foreign. Unavailability feels meaningful when availability feels suspicious. Intensity becomes a stand-in for intimacy. Here is a reframing that gently destabilizes the old story. You were not addicted to people. You were loyal to an emotional pattern that began long before adulthood. The anima, Jung's metaphor for the inner feminine, the man's instinctive relationship to emotion, beauty, and connection, internalizes early relational wounds. And when this inner image is shaped by unpredictability, the man unconsciously seeks partners who echo that pattern. Not because he wants to suffer, but because the nervous system recognizes what it learned first. Predictability can feel dull when chaos has been the baseline. The nervous system plays a central role here. Trauma-linked attraction relies on a subtle loop between dopamine and oxytocin. Dopamine spikes with uncertainty, the delayed text, the mixed signal, the sudden warmth followed by withdrawal. Oxytocin reaches for bonding. When the two systems collide, the body interprets unpredictability as significance. It is not a moral failure. It is biology remembering what it survived. But something changes after 50. Not dramatically, not overnight, but with a quiet clarity. The body tires of volatility. Regulatory capacity shifts. The emotional storms that once felt intoxicating now feel physically draining. And the man begins to notice, sometimes reluctantly, that he no longer feels pulled toward what once fascinated him. This is the confronting sentence that often brings a deep exhale. What you call becoming picky is actually becoming regulated. The absence of old attractions is not a loss of passion. It is the loss of tolerance for reenacting old wounds. The nervous system is no longer seduced by the familiar ache. It starts to register safety as meaningful rather than boring. Peace is not empty anymore. It is spacious. A man at 54 once described this shift in a way that many find resonant. After years of confusing intensity with connection, he wrote that he could suddenly feel the earliest signs of misattunement in his body, not as drama, but as a subtle dissonance. A tone in the voice, a quick dismissal of his depth, a conversation that left him slightly smaller than before. Where he once worked harder to prove himself, he now felt a quiet fading of interest. Not rejection, not judgment, simply clarity. This is the midpoint of the journey. It signals that the relational field is reorganizing itself. Attraction is no longer guided by wound-seeking reenactment, but by a nervous system that is finally allowed to tell the truth. This shift does not require perfection or complete healing. It requires awareness. And awareness is what makes space for a new form of solitude, one that does not arise from withdrawal, but from integration. Before we move on, here is the shadow pattern promised earlier, the one many men mistake for wisdom. Emotional detachment is often misinterpreted as maturity, when it is actually a shield built from exhaustion. This shield forms when a man has been hurt enough times to confuse numbness with neutrality. It feels calm on the surface, but underneath lies avoidance, not peace. In the next chapter, we turn towards solitude, not as an escape, not as a symptom, but as a forge where the personality begins to consolidate its late-life power. As the nervous system settles and the old relational patterns loosen their grip, many men enter a period of increased solitude. At first glance, it can look like withdrawal, especially after the emotional turbulence of earlier years. He may feel less inclined to pursue companionship, less energized by social demands, more attuned to the quiet corners of his own inner life. But beneath the surface, something far more nuanced is unfolding. For much of adulthood, solitude served as an anesthetic. It softened the edges of old wounds. It created distance from relationships that triggered ancient patterns. It offered protection when the world felt too loud or too demanding. In those years, solitude was not peace. It was triage, a way to stop the bleeding long enough to function, a temporary shelter built out of necessity rather than choice. Here is a reframing that often clarifies this stage. When solitude is used to numb, it shrinks a man's world. When it is used to integrate, it enlarges it. The shift happens quietly. The man who once entered solitude to hide now enters it to listen. The silence that once brought rumination now brings coherence. The body, once braced for emotional threat, begins to soften. And for the first time, thoughts move at a pace that feels humane. This transformation is supported by something rarely discussed in mainstream conversations: the maturation of metacognition. Research suggests that the ability to see one's own patterns with clarity often peaks between 50 and 65. It is not simply wisdom, it is neurological integration. The mind becomes capable of observing itself without the urgency or defensiveness that defined earlier decades. Patterns that once felt tangled now reveal their shape. Reactions that once felt automatic begin to feel optional. Here is the slightly confronting line that often brings stillness to the room. You are not avoiding people. You are avoiding the unintegrated versions of yourself that other people awakened. The anger that erupted too quickly, the compliance that surfaced too easily, the longing that attached too fast. Solitude was a way to step back from these internal figures until the man was ready to meet them directly. As he begins to welcome these parts, anger without shame, longing without collapse, sensitivity without apology, solitude changes its flavor. It stops feeling like exile and starts feeling like home. Not a home he hides in, but a home he returns from. The difference is profound. There are subtle indicators of this shift, and they tend to arise not as revelations, but as sensations. Silence no longer carries guilt. Thoughts no longer spiral into old narratives. The body no longer prepares for impact when nothing is happening. There is room to breathe without bracing. space without fear, presence without performance. This stage does not require perfection. It requires honesty. And in that honesty, the man begins to reclaim energy that was once tied up in self-protection. Energy that can now be directed toward creation, connection, expression, or meaning, whatever form his inner architecture has been quietly waiting to grow into. Solitude becomes a forge when it frees rather than confines. It becomes a place where fragments melt into coherence. And coherence is what gives this rare personality its late-life power. Not dominance, not authority in the traditional sense, but cultural weight. A way of being that steadies the room. Not because he is trying to impress anyone, but because he has nothing left to perform. With this integration, the final transformation becomes possible. The moment when the long maturing personality steps into its full fruiting. And it is to that culmination we turn in the next and final chapter. By the time a man reaches this stage of his life, something in his inner landscape has changed so gradually he may not notice it at first. What once felt fragmented now feels coherent. What once felt like contradiction now feels like depth. And the very traits that made him feel out of place in youth begin to reveal their purpose. The long fermentation, the slow maturation, the years of seeming misalignment, they start to make sense when viewed through the lens of an orchard that was never meant to bear fruit early. There is a turning point here, and it rarely arrives as a dramatic revelation. It arrives as recognition, a quiet realization that the delay was not a failure of will, discipline, or character. It was the psyche gathering symbolic weight. The years of misinterpretation, the periods of collapse, the painful repetitions in relationships, all of them contributed to an inner density that could not have formed any other way. The rare personality matures slowly because it is weaving meaning, while others are collecting milestones. Here is a reframing that often brings a gentle exhale. Your late blooming is not a second chance. It is the first time you are living from your actual center. This is when the father shadow loosens its grip, not because the past disappears, but because the man is no longer living under inherited authority. He authorizes himself, quietly, steadily, without needing applause. Decisions come from alignment rather than fear. Boundaries come from clarity rather than anger. The internal hierarchy shifts, and sovereignty replaces performance. His relationships begin to reflect this shift. Not dramatically, not instantly, but unmistakably. He no longer confuses chaos with chemistry or intensity with intimacy. He values reciprocity over reenactment. Presence becomes more compelling than passion alone. And the people who enter his life in this stage often meet a version of him that is grounded, aware, and emotionally attuned in ways he could not access earlier. Purpose, too, begins to crystallize, not as a grand mission, but as coherence. The man becomes mentor-like, not because he seeks the role, but because his presence carries a kind of quiet authority. Others sense the stability he hard-won through years of misunderstanding and inner work. His words may be simple, but they come from a place where experience has been metabolized, rather than merely endured. This stage is well captured in a single image, an old orchard tree that looked barren for years. The bark weathered, the branches crooked, seasons passed with little evidence of growth. But underground, the roots were deepening, thickening, anchoring, and when the fruit finally emerged, its sweetness carried the memory of every season that shaped it. As we close, there is no need for a grand declaration. If any line in this journey mirrored your own life, one quiet sentence is enough. A sentence that signals recognition, both to yourself and to anyone who happens to read it. It might be as simple as acknowledging that you were never late. You were simply ripening, and perhaps that recognition is the beginning of the life that was waiting for you all along.